I was thinking about this and thinking, you know, storytelling and thinking about who are some of the best storytellers that we know in science. And I'm sure that we all have, journalists that we enjoy reading. There's a couple of people I know who write a really good intro that will get you hooked. Um, there's other people who can sort of weave a narrative through through a piece, whether it's written or on the radio or a visual broadcast. And I think I was thinking about the ways that we do it and why we do it. Um, and how we can sort of do it a bit with science. And I've got a couple of examples at the end of things that I've done recently. And I have to say, when I was kind of put on the spot and thinking, what are the examples I was going to use? I was thinking, how have I done this recently? And I suppose we probably all kind of do it a little bit innately because we're used to having to sort of we're a step removed from the science, and we find it easier probably than the scientists who work on the science to look at the big picture and pick out the key themes or the key messages. And so I suppose I was thinking about why do we tell stories? And I think humans are storytellers. It's how we've passed on information since we've been on the planet, really. Often I think we are at the center of our own narratives. I think we like to tell stories that involve ourselves. But I think that doesn't necessarily mean, I think it's sometimes easier to make science relatable if we can relate it to humans or to the human story, but that doesn't mean we always have to. But we do need to make it kind of accessible and relatable, I think, in some way. And stories is certainly one way that we can make science relatable and accessible. So why do we need to tell stories about science? Why is it important to communicate about science? And you probably all know this, so I'm not gonna, go on about it too much. But if we don't support scientists to tell their stories, then either the stories don't get told or someone else takes charge of the narrative. And I think, we we want to control our own narratives, and we want our scientists to be able to control their own narratives. There's lots of different audiences, from policymakers and funders and patients and sort of general lay audiences, or school children, and the way that you shape your narrative is going to depend on the audience. Most of my experiences of thinking about the general public, whether I've worked in a charity and I'm trying to get people to donate money or communicate medical research to patients. I've done a little bit with policymakers. I'm working with a group in Oxford at the moment who do a lot of work on meat and the environment, and we certainly try and tell stories to policymakers, but also to the general public through engagement as well. So the way that you shape your narrative is going to depend on your audience. So I think you want to capture the attention. You want to stand out from the crowd. I know, we don't do the quality control for our academics, but we believe in them and we know why they're kind of the experts in their field. We want to make sure that they stand out from the crowd and that they kind of create and control their own narratives. It can help them attract funding. It can help them attract collaboration. You can shape, I've sort of touched a little bit on policymakers, but you can shape debate and discussion. So yeah, and this is, I just like this image because it was lots of people saying, yeah, science is important, yeah. So how do you get your message to hit home? How do you get that impact? And I think in order to have impact and land with the audience or the audiences, you need to ensure that you've got clarity. I think it's really easy to get bogged down in the detail. And I think because science and research can be so complex, it's kind of tricky. And it's one of the things when I do media training with academics, or when I'm preparing them for interviews, whether it's with the public or for schools engagement or with the media, you just really have to get them to think about their kind of key messages. Like, what are the key points you would want the audience to take home? And sure, even if you're presenting, I think, as an academic to your peers at a conference and you're providing a lot of detail, they're not going to retain all that detail. They will come back and look at the full data set or the full research paper. So you still want to think about what the kind of key points are that they're going to take away with them. So I think you have to think about what you want people to take away, and you have to think about what you want to remove. And I think a lot of our job as communicators is removing unnecessary information, sort of being an editor and working with the scientist on taking out the bits that are, important but not always kind of key in that particular communication. And I will kind of come on to it later. Often we'll be working with researchers who are publishing a new paper, and often the reason that the paper is being published isn't the thing that you're going to go out and put in your press release or you're going to make a video about, because that may not be the most exciting thing to a lay audience. The journal may be publishing it because it's a new method, or because because of the astonishing way that the technique was done for the first time, whatever it is. Or I think I've got an example further down of it might be a new sort of data set, and it might be really incredible the way that they've worked the algorithm out, but you're not going to, in telling the story, talk about the algorithm. You're going to talk about what they found and why it's important, even if that's not why the journal's publishing it. So I think messaging is the key point, and I think you need to think about your when I started work, the BBC website was the best place to look at the first 3 paragraphs of the BBC website. And I don't know, many of you will not be old enough to remember, but before the internet, there were these services on television. You may remember teletext and CFAX, where you would just go to these pages with really bold text on the page, and it was new, like it was updated news, but there may be 2 or 3 pages for a news story, and it would slowly scroll through them. And on the first page, there was enough space on your television for 3 paragraphs. And so the BBC, when I started work in 2000, and when I started at Nature at 2004, one of our editors, his wife still worked for the BBC, and they still taught them to write as if they were writing for CFAX, where the first 3 paragraphs were all you were going to see. Now, these days, you sort of think that's above the fold, right? It's before you start scrolling. So you've got to think about, what do I need to get across? So it's who, where, when, how, why, when. Some of it isn't going to be, but if you work, when I worked for the journals, the where was always the journal name. In your institute, the where might be the University of Tokyo or the University of wherever, or, who is the academics. I think in science, we don't often talk about the how, like the methodology isn't always the most riveting thing. But yeah, sometimes the when, like I've got an example of the oldest heart ever discovered to date, and so the when on that one is 350 million years ago. But so you can think about the who, what, where, why, when, and I think it's important to put that in your top 3 paragraphs of your press release, or in a blog you might have an introductory paragraph, and then get to hook the reader, and then come down to this information. And we'll talk about how you do it in video, like visually. I think often on the radio you might get like a visual, like radio is a very visual medium, isn't it? So you might get a really nice description or some audio that sort of hooks you into the story, and then they tell you those details, those key details. I think also, when you're thinking about your messages, it's really easy to think in 3s. For some reason, the brain works well remembering things in 3s. So I usually think of 3 messages. Usually when I'm talking to researchers, we use an example of the story house. So I have I'm going to just draw it now because I didn't think to put this in my presentation. But you literally have this is my story house. So you literally have this is your kind of overarching, what do you want people to take away? And then this might be 3 subs. So you can think of these as 3 rooms and 3 sub messages with a bit more detail. And then underneath you can put like anything else. And sometimes you're going to be thinking about, are they going to get asked questions? Is there controversy? Do I need to know anything for context? But really the priority is that sort of overarching message, and then 3 sub messages. Often when I'm working with media, I think you want to create sound bites and analogies. Analogies kind of give you that hook. It gives you something to something that you can retain. If you can think of a really good analogy or a really good sound bite, people might remember that. I was talking to a researcher last week, and I wrote the press release yesterday about he was talking about, they were on a research vessel and they saw an iceberg carve off from a glacier in the Antarctic. And their research, which is coming out next week, so I won't break any embargoes, but their research is about understanding what happens to the ocean when that occurs. And they were just there doing some measurements for something else, and they just happened to be there when this iceberg carved off. And he said to me, our measurements went off the chart, and that was when we understood that this thing that we've never previously observed, and no one's ever previously observed it, but will have been happening since icebergs have been carving off Antarctica and probably elsewhere. That's how we understood what was happening, but it was just by chance that they were there. So it's a really nice way to tell it. Now, the paper talks about that process and why it's important, but it also helps them understand ocean mixing and that impact on climate change and ice melting and that kind of thing. But that was such a nice story. It was so nice the way that he told it, and that comes across in the press release as well. Keep it short and keep it simple. I go back to even if you are an academic presenting to your peers, you might have 30 minutes. You might have spent 2 years doing the work. You cannot go into all the detail. You have to keep it short. If you are in communication and you asked to do a broadcast interview, you might get 90 seconds. So in that case, you're not going to get through your 3 messages. You have to remember your 3 messages, but you're not going to get through them. I think in a press release or in a blog, you've got a bit more space to go into those detail, but you still have to keep it short, keep it simple, because you've got to retain that audience interest. I'm not massively pleased with this slide. It doesn't quite convey what I wanted it to convey, but I couldn't find the image that I wanted to show. And I was sort of thinking about the way that advertisers will advertise to us, and the way that, you see an advert for a mobile phone and it doesn't tell you it's got this much memory and the battery life is this long and this is how many photos you can take with it. It will show you people connecting with a phone and how beautiful, and making memories with your phone, and how you can edit the photos to make your memories more special. Or, I'm thinking there were adverts in the pandemic for probably like Zoom and Microsoft Teams or Skype that were about connecting people. They don't tell you about the technology and all the qualities it's got, but it sells you a story. It taps into your emotions. So I was thinking with this, you've got this laptop over here. They're not going to show you we've got the latest keyboard, it's got this much RAM. They're going to say, they're not going to talk about the microchips and that kind of thing. They're going to talk about how your kids can use it for their virtual lessons at school and to do online learning to extend their social skills. So there's always it's tapping into to emotion, and it's not giving you all the detail. We don't have to be quite like advertisers, and some of that is kind of cynical, I think, as well. But it just I think advertisers do it very well. So I was thinking about a couple of examples and the reason for publication versus the story we told, and then I can't remember what the format you and whether you want to do a few questions first before we hand over to Rowan. Yeah, okay. So this was a paper that was published in Science in early September, and the academics are at Curtin University in Western Australia. They found these specimens, and what was lovely was that I'd worked with these academics before, about 10 years ago when I was at Nature, and they'd published the earliest live birth, because they'd found some very similar specimens where they had found the fossil and then preserved umbilical cord, showing that these fish were not laying eggs, and obviously they're kind of early jawed vertebrates. So it shows a period in evolutionary history. So what's really interesting about these fossils is that they were preserved, and some of the soft tissue was preserved, so they were still able to see the heart, liver, and stomach, and some of the other organs. And what they found, some of the reason for publishing would have been about this discovery that this is how the organs were formed, the organ formation inside the bodies of these early jawed vertebrates, and how different that is from the jawless vertebrates that went before. And the academic said to me, we thought that things would have progressed much more slowly. You think of evolution as something that happens like a little step at a time, but this find shows a huge jump between the jawless and the jawed vertebrates in the way that the organs are set up, and the way that they would have used the liver as a swim liver like modern sharks today. And she said something else really lovely to me. She said, these fish literally have their hearts in their mouths, just under their gills, like sharks today. So it shows this kind of astonishing thing about evolution. And she told it really well. Um, but really, sort of technically, the reason that the paper was being published in part was because they'd found this preserved soft tissue, which is kind of incredible. And in part because they'd used sort of incredible techniques to discern what was inside the rocks by using like extra the synchrotron in Geneva, I think. Anyway, it was September, so it was a long time ago now, and I've worked on several stories since. But so technically, yes, there's an evolutionary reason why they're publishing the paper, but there's also a technical reason, and it's to do with like the technique of how they've looked at inside the fossils. But yeah, so the way we told the story is it was the oldest heart found to date. It was 280 million years old. These fish literally have their hearts in their mouths. It's something that people can remember. It's interesting. And it's the first time that a model of the complete shaped heart in an aphrodite in this ancient fish. It was made up of two chambers with a smaller chamber sitting on top. So it was just a really interesting evolutionary story. And it's one that we thought, now what happened that week? Was that the week that the Queen, it was the week that the Queen died over here. So we thought that this fish was literally going to walk onto all of the front pages all around the world. And it did get really amazing coverage, but it didn't get quite so much over here as we would have liked because it was the same time as the Queen died. So hopefully you saw that story. And the way that we told that narrative, this image here is a still from the video that we used. We had these images to sort of, like an image can tell 1,000 words, and that helps with your narrative because you can show quite simply what you're trying to communicate. And I suppose that's worth thinking about when you're thinking about your narratives. What are the visuals that can accompany them? So for this glacier story, they've got incredible beautiful photos that can go alongside the glacier story, and they've also got like a model that shows an image of what's happening in the ocean when the glaciers calve. And then with this one, the oldest heart, we just knew it was only going to get coverage if we had images of those original stones. They're not very photogenic, actually, the stones with the fossils in, but we needed some images of those, so we did some filming at the museum with the researchers of those fossils. We had the images that you've seen here. There was a video we made available, so we built up a load of other resources around the narrative, and I think that's really important with certain stories. I think particularly for the stories for the things that captivated our hearts as children, dinosaurs, space, volcanoes, those kind of things, fossils. I think it's quite easy to think of visuals, and some other stories it's kind of harder. But if you can think of some visuals and supporting materials to support your narrative, I think that really helps. This is another paper I worked on over the summer. It's with the group that I work with in Oxford that look at meat and dairy and health and environment. And they had created a database. These are UK foods that you buy in UK supermarkets. Until now, we'd been able to say, if you look at wheat, it's got this environmental impact. If you look at beef, it's got this environmental impact, and milk generally this, and this country. Single ingredient products, we can say this is their impact. But where you've got multiple ingredients, in the UK, you have to list the ingredients, but you don't say what proportions they are. But some of them do, and some of them don't. So they put all of this information into a very clever algorithm. And so that was the reason it was being published, was because it was this very clever algorithm. They'd done a lot of modeling work around it. But we weren't going to talk about exactly how they'd done the work and exactly how that algorithm worked. I mean, that we were open about it. We're not trying to hide anything. We were transparent, but we wanted to sort of talk about why is this important. So it's important because now you can compare food products and their environmental impact. We also wanted to communicate it's the first step. If they have milk in their ingredients list, we've assumed the milk is all from, there's different ways of producing different ingredients. Things can have flown across the world. They can have been reared in deforested Amazon. They can have been fed soy from like deforested parts of, there are different ways of, there are different environmental impacts depending on how food is produced. So it's a first step. We're very clear about that. But the narrative was really about, like, now it becomes possible to compare and it becomes possible to sort of think about putting labels on foods that would allow consumers to make more environmentally sustainable food purchasing decisions. Of course, at this stage, the real exciting thing is that it allows companies to think about doing that too, and it could generate real change because companies will start to think about it, and they'll start to think about their ingredients, and they'll start to think about eco labels. But that's not the story that we're going to tell if we're talking to consumers, because people want to know why it impacts them and how it impacts them. So those are the examples I'm given. I'm happy to sort of do questions, talk further. I just think I just like this. I was looking at storytelling and I just found this image and I thought that's perfect. People remember stories, so that's why we do it. Is because people will remember it. They might not necessarily remember if you talk them through a data set like the foods, the food and environmental impacts. And I can tell you the 4 things that they looked at: biodiversity, water use, land use, and greenhouse gases. You might not remember those, but you'll remember the top line, which is that it can give you a comparable method of looking at foods and their environmental impacts. So yeah, so I think people remember stories much better than they remember lots of other things.